The hall was filled with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses when everything shifted in a single breath. I walked in with my heart open, carrying the quiet pride of a mother who had dreamed of that day for years. The chandeliers reflected in the polished floor, the scent of flowers filled the air, and everywhere I looked, I saw people celebrating the union of two young lives. But for me, that moment froze in a way that no clock could measure. The sound of a voice, sharp and merciless, cut through the celebration and left me standing in the center of the room like a shadow that no one wanted. What happened in those seconds was not just an argument, not just a quarrel between relatives that could be brushed aside later. It was a public execution of my dignity. When the words fell, they were not whispered in private, but thrown at me with such force that everyone turned to look. Guests stopped mid-conversation, waiters paused with trays suspended in the air, and even the band let the last notes hang unfinished. My name, my presence, my very existence had been denied in front of every pair of eyes, gathered to witness what should have been the happiest chapter of my son's life. There is a cruelty in being humiliated in public that no private insult can match. It strips away not only your pride, but also your right to hide your pain. My hands trembled, but not a single gesture could shield me from the dozens of faces staring in disbelief. Some mouths opened slightly, as if trying to form words of comfort, but none of them spoke. Their silence wrapped around me like a cold rope, tightening until it became hard to breathe. And in that silence, I realized something devastating. Humiliation shared by witnesses multiplies. It grows heavier because you know the story will travel beyond the walls of that hall. I thought of the paradox of celebration. Weddings are designed to unite families, to create memories that last for generations. Yet there I was, turned into a cautionary tale, a spectacle of rejection. Anthropologists often write about rituals of passage, ceremonies where one generation blesses the next. But what happens when, instead of being welcomed, the elder is cast aside? That night was no longer about unity, but about erasure, as though my presence contaminated the purity of their new beginning. Even the smallest details of that moment etched themselves into my memory with painful clarity. The way the satin of the bride's dress shimmered under the lights while her voice rose against me. The gasps of a group of children in the corner who could not fully understand what had been said, but understood enough to recognize cruelty. The sudden clatter of a fork dropped onto a plate somewhere near the front. These fragments returned to me like shards of glass, impossible to smooth out or ignore. Psychologists say that when someone is humiliated in public, the brain processes the event in the same way it processes physical pain. It triggers the same areas that light up when you are burned or cut. I felt that truth in my body. My chest tightened as if someone had pressed a hand against it. My stomach knotted. My legs wanted to give way. Yet I remained upright, because collapsing would have been to confirm the words thrown at me. I would not let them see me fall. But inside, I was already on the ground. There is also something universal about that kind of betrayal. Every parent who has sacrificed for their child carries an unspoken expectation that love will be honored, at least in small ways, at least with basic respect. Standing there, stripped of that respect, I became a mirror for others in the room who knew the bitterness of family wounds. I could feel their unease not only because of the scene unfolding, but because it reminded them of their own fractures, the times when love was not returned, when loyalty was betrayed. Humiliation in front of others has a strange way of making time distort. The entire episode may have lasted only a minute, perhaps less, but to me, it stretched endlessly. I could hear the echo of the words bouncing off the marble walls, replaying louder each time, while my own thoughts screamed silently. This cannot be happening. This is my son's wedding. This is supposed to be joy. And yet joy had been replaced by shame so complete that it felt like the air itself had turned against me. Later, when people would recall the evening, they would likely remember the flowers, the food, the laughter that returned after the storm. But for me, the wedding exists as a fracture in memory. Before the words, I was a mother invited to witness her child's happiness. After the words, I was something else entirely. Someone pushed out of the circle, someone who did not belong. That transformation from belonging to erasure is what lingers most deeply. In every culture, being denied by one's own family carries a particular sting. Friends may leave you, lovers may betray you, but when the bond of blood is broken, it tears into identity itself. As I stood there, absorbing the rejection, I could not help but think of all the mothers across time who had known the same pain in different forms. Abandoned in old age, ignored after years of sacrifice, silenced when their voices once carried weight. My story was not unique, and that realization brought a strange mixture of sorrow and solidarity. What cut deepest, however, was not only the cruelty of the words, but the permanence they carried. Words are not stones you can pick up and throw away. They remain, lingering in memory, reshaping how you see yourself and how others see you. In that moment, I felt my place in my son's life evaporate, and with it, years of meaning I had built. That is why humiliation burns long after the crowd disperses, long after the music resumes. It plants a seed of doubt that grows even in silence. And so, while the celebration continued around me, while glasses were lifted again and laughter cautiously returned, I stood in a world apart. To them, perhaps it was just an uncomfortable moment that would fade with time. To me, it was the opening of a wound that would never fully close, because what happened in that hall was not a passing outburst. It was a declaration that my existence no longer mattered in the story of my own family, a sentence carried out not in private, but in front of witnesses who would never forget. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Have you ever experienced something similar? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt stories like this. The words had been spoken, and in their aftermath I felt my chest cave in, as if the very air around me had grown heavy and hostile. A mother's heart is not designed to withstand that kind of blow, especially not in front of strangers, relatives, and the very child for whom she once carried the weight of the world. Shock is not always loud. Sometimes it is paralyzing, quiet, like a fog rolling into the soul. My eyes searched desperately for something familiar, some anchor that could hold me steady, but all I found were stares, some filled with pity, others with judgment, none offering comfort. My body was present in that hall, but my spirit felt like it had been expelled, hovering outside the celebration that I had entered with trembling joy only moments earlier. In that instant, 1,000 memories collided with the present. The nights of illness when I held him against my chest until morning came. The times when I denied myself small comforts so that he could have shoes that fit, meals that nourished, and books that opened his mind. A mother's sacrifices are made quietly, almost invisibly, and always with the expectation that love will be enough to bind the years together. To be rejected after all of that was not just painful, it was incomprehensible. I felt as though reality itself had split in two, the world where I believed love was unbreakable, and the world where my own child could let me stand alone in disgrace. There is something about the human heart that makes betrayal by blood feel different from all others. Friends may come and go, marriages may falter, but the bond between mother and child is supposed to be untouchable, the one certainty in an uncertain life. That night shattered that illusion for me. The sharpness of the rejection cut deeper than any knife, leaving me wondering how something so sacred could be so fragile. It reminded me of stories I had heard from other mothers, whispered in kitchens or shared with hushed voices in waiting rooms, where love was tested and sometimes destroyed by the very children it had nurtured. Suddenly, I was not just hearing those stories, I was living one. As the shock pulsed through me, I noticed the smallest details around me with strange intensity. The flicker of candle flames along the tables seemed harsher, almost mocking in their brightness. The rhythm of shoes tapping nervously against the floor echoed louder in my ears. Even the scent of roses, once sweet, now carried the bitterness of a scene that could not be undone. It was as if every sense in my body had conspired to remind me of the moment, ensuring I could never forget. Trauma does that. It carves itself into memory with precision, engraving every sound and scent so it can return in the quiet of future nights. I wondered in that split second if I had become invisible to my own son. Perhaps he saw me as a relic of a past life, someone to be left behind as he built his future with her. The idea burned because I remembered all the times I had imagined his wedding day, how I thought he would look at me with gratitude, how he might even whisper a word of thanks for the years that had led him there. Instead, his eyes avoided mine, and in that avoidance I felt a wound that would not heal. Silence can be crueler than words because it leaves you alone with questions that may never be answered. The heart of a mother is resilient, but resilience is not the same as invincibility. That evening reminded me that even the strongest love can be broken under the weight of rejection. The pain was not just about that single moment. It was about everything it represented. It was about the hours of work that no one saw, the meals skipped, the prayers whispered, the belief that raising a child with love was enough to guarantee at least a fragment of respect in return. That belief crumbled in front of me, and as it did, the shock of the moment deepened into a grief so heavy it felt eternal. What startled me most was how quickly joy can turn to despair. Just minutes before, I had been adjusting the folds of my dress, reminding myself to smile through tears of pride, rehearsing in my mind how I would embrace them after the vows were exchanged. Now, instead of tears of pride, I was swallowing tears of humiliation. Life has a way of twisting without warning, reminding us that happiness is fragile and that even the most sacred occasions can be invaded by cruelty. As I stood frozen, I felt as though the entire hall was holding its breath, waiting to see if I would crumble or fight back. But fighting back never crossed my mind. My heart was too stunned to form words, too bruised to raise its defenses. I realized that this was not a battle I could win, because it was not about argument or reason. It was about rejection, plain and final, and no plea could undo it. In that moment, I was no longer part of the story unfolding before me. I had been written out, erased in real time, in front of people who would later whisper about the scene as though it were theater. When the music cautiously returned and conversation slowly resumed, I felt myself drifting inside. Shock has a way of numbing the body, of creating a distance between what is happening and what the heart can process. Yet beneath the numbness, pain gathers, waiting for the silence of the night when it will no longer be hidden by the noise of a crowd. That was the weight I carried as the evening moved forward without me, the realization that I was present in the room, but absent in every other way. And it is in that absence where the deepest wounds begin to form. Because once you are excluded from a moment that should have been yours, every memory that follows is poisoned. The shock of being silenced, of being unwanted, leaves scars that ripple into the future, shaping not only how you see the ones who rejected you, but how you see yourself. I stood there, a mother-turned stranger, clutching a heart that refused to understand how love could be met with such cruelty, and knowing that nothing would ever feel the same again. What do you think about the choices made in this story? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you enjoy these kinds of real-life narratives, hit subscribe so you never miss a video. Her voice was not trembling with nerves like a bride on her wedding day. It was firm, sharp, and carried a weight that demanded the attention of every single person in the room. Until that night, her disdain for me had been masked behind polite smiles, quick glances away, and the kind of carefully measured words that never crossed the line into outright hostility. But at the altar of her own celebration, with her dress gleaming and her hand clasped around my son's, she no longer felt the need to hide what she truly thought of me. She stood tall, surrounded by witnesses, and tore away the fragile veil that had kept our differences discreet. There is something chilling about being confronted in public by someone who clearly views you as an enemy. I had seen flashes of her resentment before, the way she tightened her lips when I gave my son advice, the way her eyes narrowed when he laughed at one of my stories. But I had convinced myself that these were small jealousies, the kind of growing pains that any family experiences when a new person enters its circle. I never imagined she would escalate from subtle disapproval to a brutal declaration that my presence was unwelcome, and that she would choose her own wedding as the stage for it. Her words carried an authority that surprised me, as though the vows had already given her the power to rewrite the family structure. It reminded me of stories I had read about historical queens or political wives who seized influence not quietly, but by declaring dominance in front of the court. In her eyes, that hall was her court, those guests her audience, and I was the intruder who needed to be cast out in order for her reign to begin. The cruelty of the situation was not accidental. It was calculated. She wanted me not only removed, but humiliated, stripped of dignity so thoroughly that no one could question who held control in that family from now on. I wondered, in that awful moment, what stories she had told herself to justify treating me this way. Perhaps she believed I was an obstacle to their happiness, that I represented a hold on my son's loyalty she could never fully possess. Perhaps she saw in me a mirror of her own insecurities, one she needed to shatter publicly so that she could feel secure in her place. It is a strange truth that human beings often attack what they fear most, and sometimes what they fear most is love they cannot compete with. Her voice did not falter. She spoke with the confidence of someone who knew no one would stop her. My son stood beside her, silent, his gaze lowered, his jaw tense, and that silence became her weapon, a confirmation that she had the power to speak for both of them. Each word she hurled in my direction became heavier because it was not only hers, but his by omission. It was no longer just the opinion of a new wife, but the shared position of the couple. That is what made it so devastating. The guests looked at her with a mixture of shock and fascination. Some admired her boldness, mistaking cruelty for strength. Others looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, unwilling to intervene. A few avoided my eyes altogether, as though watching me endure her attack was too unbearable. Yet no one moved to stop her. She had the floor, and her performance was unstoppable. Public humiliation has always carried a strange magnetism, drawing people in even as it horrifies them. It is the same reason crowds gather around accidents, unable to look away even when the sight is painful. I thought of all the subtle signs I had dismissed in the months leading up to that day. The way she corrected me sharply when I spoke, as though my words were outdated. The way she hesitated to include me in family plans. The way she once told me, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, that her home was hers alone and no one else's opinions mattered. These were warning shots, signals of a brewing storm. I ignored them because I believed love for my son would be enough to bridge the distance. But storms never disappear because we pretend not to see them. They gather strength in silence until the first lightning strike splits the sky. What struck me most was the satisfaction in her expression. She was not trembling, not regretful, not even conflicted. She seemed almost relieved, as though she had been waiting for this moment. Her eyes were steady, her chin raised, her voice unwavering. It was not a slip of temper. It was the unveiling of her true feelings, carefully timed for maximum impact. I realized then that I had not misread her all along. I had only chosen to hope that time and kindness would soften her heart. But kindness cannot melt a heart that sees you not as family, but as competition. In many cultures, the role of the daughter-in-law is seen as one of integration, of building bridges between families. But in some households, it becomes a battle for territory, a struggle for influence over the son caught between two women. I had entered that hall believing we were joining together in celebration. She had entered it believing she was claiming victory over me. And so, with her declaration, she redrew the boundaries of the family, placing herself at the center and pushing me to the margins. The humiliation was sharp, but beneath it grew another realization. This was not just about me and her. It was about my son's choice, his silence, and the dynamic they had chosen to build. She had spoken the words, but his lack of resistance allowed them to become reality. That truth settled into me heavier than any insult, because it meant that what had been revealed was not a sudden eruption of hatred, but the culmination of a long and silent shift in power. And as I stood there, listening to her words echo against the walls of a hall filled with people, I understood something deeply unsettling. This was not the beginning of hostility. It was the moment hostility shed its disguise. Every small dismissal, every quiet look, every gesture that had once seemed trivial was now part of a pattern I could no longer deny. And with that clarity came the crushing weight of knowing that nothing about this family would ever be the same again. Your voice matters. Tell us how this story made you feel in the comments. And if you want to join our community and follow more emotional journeys, make sure to subscribe to the channel. What cut deeper than her words was the silence that followed them. I turned my eyes to my son, hoping to find in his face some trace of defense, a flicker of loyalty, a gesture that would tell me he still saw me as his mother. But his lips remained closed, his gaze fixed on the floor as though the marble tiles were suddenly the most fascinating thing in the world. Silence in moments like that is not neutral. It speaks louder than shouting. It tells you, without needing words, where someone's loyalty truly rests. In families, silence often carries as much meaning as speech. Anthropologists have written about how silence in rituals or ceremonies can signify reverence or agreement. That evening I realized it can also signify betrayal. My son's refusal to raise his voice on my behalf did not shield me from pain. It multiplied it. If a stranger had attacked me, I would have expected him to protect me. But when it was his own wife, his choice of family, he chose her by saying nothing. His silence became her ally, her invisible partner in humiliation. The silence stretched endlessly, and every second felt like a blade carving deeper into my heart. I remembered the countless times I had spoken up for him when he was younger. When teachers underestimated him, I fought for him. When children mocked him, I defended him. When the world seemed too harsh, I was the voice that stood between him and the cruelty outside. And now, when I needed him most, he chose to stand still, his silence becoming a wall I could not climb. There is a peculiar cruelty in watching your child stand mute while you are torn apart. It is like drowning, while the one person who knows how to swim chooses to stay on the shore. His silence was not passive. It was active consent to my erasure. People often think betrayal happens with lies or insults, but betrayal also happens in the stillness of someone who could have spoken but chose not to. I wondered what was happening inside him at that moment. Was he ashamed? Was he conflicted? Or had he already accepted that his role as husband required silence in the face of his mother's pain? In psychology, there is a concept called role conflict, when someone feels torn between two identities that demand loyalty. Sons caught between wives and mothers often experience this conflict. But that evening, my son did not look torn. He looked resolved, as though he had already chosen his side long before that moment. The image of him standing silent while his wife humiliated me became seared into my memory with the clarity of a photograph. He did not reach for my hand. He did not lift his eyes to mine. He did not speak my name. His silence was complete, and it left me abandoned not only by words, but by presence. I realized then that I was alone in a way I had never been before. Alone not because people were absent, but because the one person who should have defended me had vanished into stillness. What makes silence so devastating is that it robs you of certainty. Words, however painful, give you something to confront. You can argue with them, deny them, resist them. But silence leaves you stranded, trapped in questions that have no answers. Does he agree with her? Does he think I deserved it? Does he believe I no longer matter? These questions burned hotter than any insult, and they echoed louder than her voice. In literature, silence often symbolizes emptiness, but in real life, it can feel like an earthquake. It shakes the foundation of trust, splitting it open without sound. That evening, my son's silence was an earthquake inside me. The foundation I had built with years of sacrifice cracked and crumbled in an instant. I thought of all the times he had leaned on me for strength and how quickly that history had vanished into quiet indifference. I studied his face, searching for signs of hesitation. His jaw was tight, his eyes downcast, his body rigid. Some guests might have thought he was uncomfortable, but to me, his stillness felt like confirmation. He had chosen to let her voice be the only one heard. He had chosen not to protect me, not to claim me as his mother in that moment. And in doing so, he had delivered a wound that would outlast the evening, a wound deeper than any single phrase could inflict. Silence also isolates. While she attacked me with her words, his silence built a wall between us, leaving me on one side and them on the other. That wall was invisible to everyone else, but to me it was as solid as stone. It was the wall of exclusion, the wall that told me I no longer had a place in his life. The moment she spoke and he stayed silent, that wall sealed shut. I was outside, and they were inside, and no key could open the door again. I think often about how small moments reveal the truth of relationships. People imagine betrayal as something dramatic, but more often it happens quietly, in the stillness of what is not said. That night, my son betrayed me not with a declaration, but with his refusal to speak, and that refusal hurt more than any scream ever could, because it meant he had decided, consciously or unconsciously, that protecting me was no longer worth the cost. And so I stood, surrounded by people but utterly alone. Her words had humiliated me, but his silence had destroyed something deeper. The bond between mother and son is supposed to withstand storms, but bonds can break in silence just as easily as they break in conflict. And when they do, the emptiness that follows is vast, echoing, and impossible to ignore. The weight of the silence in the hall did not vanish after her words and his silence. It lingered, and when I finally lifted my eyes to scan the room, I saw the faces of the guests, each one reflecting something different yet equally painful. Shame has a way of spreading like smoke. It fills the space, clings to skin and clothing, and even those who are not its target feel its discomfort. I could see it in the way some guests avoided my gaze, staring at their glasses of champagne as if bubbles could provide distraction. Others whispered, leaning close to one another, their eyes darting between me and the couple at the center of the stage. A few looked openly at me, sympathy written across their faces, but their pity cut just as deep. In that moment, pity was not kindness. It was confirmation that I had been reduced to an object of spectacle. There is an old saying that shame burns hottest when others are watching. I felt that truth sear through me as I stood in my seat, exposed to the crowd. I had no shield, no escape. My cheeks flushed with heat, my palms grew damp, and I could feel the blood rushing to my ears as if my own body was betraying me, making my humiliation visible to everyone. What many people forget is that shame is not just emotional, it is physical. It takes over the body in waves. Your heartbeat races, your stomach knots, your muscles stiffen as though preparing for a blow. I felt all of it while dozens of eyes weighed down on me. The guests became a mirror of judgment. Even those who meant no harm became part of the punishment, because their silence added to his silence, and together they created a chorus of abandonment. No one rose from their seat. No one called out the cruelty of what had been said. In their silence, I was not only humiliated but also condemned. I became the outsider in a story where I once believed I was a cornerstone. This is the cruel paradox of social gatherings. A wedding is supposed to unite, but under certain conditions, it turns into a stage where collective silence gives permission to cruelty. Every gesture seemed magnified. The way one woman fanned herself nervously, the way a man cleared his throat but said nothing, the way a young couple exchanged a glance that carried both discomfort and curiosity. The hall had become an audience, and I was the unwilling actress forced into a role of disgrace. The whispers that floated through the air were not words of defense, but murmurs of intrigue, the kind that ensure the story would travel far beyond those walls. Tomorrow, in kitchens and offices, in phone calls and coffee shops, people would recount what they had seen, and each retelling would stretch my humiliation further, carrying it to ears that had never even set foot in that room. There is a cruelty in collective silence that surpasses individual hostility. One person's insult can be dismissed as malice, but when an entire room chooses to remain still, the message is heavier. It says, without words, that no one believes you are worth protecting. It makes you question not only the love of your family, but the humanity of the crowd. I wondered as I looked around if any of them had ever known a similar pain, if they remembered the sting of being left alone when all they needed was one person to stand by their side. Perhaps some did, but fear kept them in their seats because standing with me would have meant standing against the bride and groom. And in weddings, loyalty bends toward the new, not the old. Shame has always been a powerful social weapon. In ancient cultures, public humiliation was a form of punishment reserved for those who broke communal rules. Stocks in the town square, shaming rituals, even the scarlet letter sewn into clothing were designed to control people through exposure. That night, I became the victim of a modern shaming ritual, and the reception hall became a court of judgment. There were no stocks or letters, but the stares and whispers performed the same function. I was marked, singled out, and diminished in a way that no private insult could ever achieve. I tried to steady myself, to breathe, to remind myself that I was more than this moment. But shame has a way of stripping away identity. It whispers that all you are is what people see at that instant. It erases the years of sacrifice, the quiet acts of love, the small triumphs of survival, and replaces them with a single label: unwanted. My body wanted to shrink, to fold into itself, to disappear so the eyes would stop burning into me. Yet disappearing was impossible. Once shame takes hold, it makes you hyper-visible. I could not hide, because my humiliation had already been witnessed. I noticed how differently people reacted depending on their place in life. Older women looked at me with something like sorrow, as if they understood what it meant to be discarded. Younger women seemed uncertain, caught between empathy and fear that someday it could happen to them. Men mostly looked away, unwilling to involve themselves. And children, too young to understand, simply sensed the tension, their wide eyes reflecting confusion. The entire range of human reaction was present in that hall, yet none of it relieved the weight pressing down on me. What haunted me most was the realization that this shame would not end when the music resumed. Shame is not bound to time. It lingers, replaying itself in memory. Long after the wedding was over, I would still see those faces in my mind, still feel the weight of their stares, still hear the whispers I could not decipher. Shame is sticky. It clings to the soul, making even the most ordinary moments afterward feel contaminated. And as I stood there, drenched in humiliation, I understood something I had never fully grasped before. Families may wound us deeply, but it is the gaze of outsiders that seals the wound. Being humiliated in private is a scar you can hide. Being humiliated in public is a scar that others help carve into your identity. That night, surrounded by people who chose silence over solidarity, I carried not only the pain of rejection, but the crushing weight of collective judgment. And that weight would follow me long after the lights dimmed and the guests returned to their homes. Weddings are supposed to be symbols of beginnings. They are meant to tie generations together, weaving past sacrifices with future hopes. The ritual itself is built on the idea of continuity, of families merging, of love extending beyond two people to embrace everyone who helped shape their lives. That night, however, the meaning of the ceremony was twisted into something unrecognizable. Instead of being a bridge, it became a knife. Instead of marking a union, it marked a severing. The celebration that should have solidified bonds was turned into a stage for my exclusion. What should have been a doorway into shared joy became a locked gate, shutting me outside of my own son's new life. The irony was sharp. I had always imagined that his wedding day would be the moment where my sacrifices would be acknowledged, even silently, even in the way he smiled at me from across the room. Parents who have struggled for years often dream of this day as a reward, not of wealth or grandeur, but of recognition. The dress rehearsals of life that led to this performance should have included me. Yet instead, I was written out of the script. The marriage vows, instead of binding our family closer, felt like a ritual of erasure. I was being replaced, not just as a priority, but as a presence, and the ceremony that should have included me as a pillar turned me into a ghost. Symbols are powerful because they are not just personal, but cultural. Across history, marriage ceremonies have served as binding contracts not only between bride and groom, but between their extended families. In medieval Europe, marriages were political tools, cementing alliances between kingdoms and clans. In many Asian cultures, weddings are considered sacred links between ancestors and descendants, carrying forward the lineage. To be excluded from such a ritual is not only a personal wound, but a cultural one. It is to be told that your blood, your history, your sacrifices are no longer part of the story being carried forward. That evening, I felt the weight of centuries of tradition twisted against me. Where once the elder was meant to bless the union, I had been positioned as an obstacle to be cast aside. I could not stop myself from noticing the details of the ritual unfolding while my heart was breaking. The white of her gown, meant to symbolize purity, now struck me as cold, almost mocking. The exchange of rings, usually seen as eternal promises, felt like shackles that bound him away from me forever. Even the music, carefully chosen to elevate the moment, became an anthem of separation, drowning my silence in melodies of joy I could no longer share. Rituals magnify meaning, and in my pain, every gesture and every object became distorted, reminding me that this was not my celebration. It was my exile. The cruelty of it all was that I had prepared myself emotionally for tears of joy, not tears of humiliation. I had thought I would be overwhelmed with pride as I watched him take this step. I had even imagined myself telling stories one day to his children about how radiant their parents had looked, how much love filled the air. But that version of the story had been stolen. What remained was a darker version, one where the wedding would forever be remembered as the day I was cast out. Every anniversary they would celebrate would also be an anniversary of my rejection. The two events had fused together, inseparable, bound by the cruel symbolism of that night. Sociologists often write about the concept of rites of passage, ceremonies that mark transitions in life. These rites are meant to reaffirm community, to signal belonging. Yet what happens when a rite of passage does the opposite? When it does not integrate, but excludes? That night became, for me, an anti-ritual. Instead of being welcomed into the next stage of family life, I was declared obsolete. Instead of being honored as the past that made the future possible, I was discarded as irrelevant. The ceremony, which should have been a communal embrace, became a public rejection. It is a strange thing how humans remember moments. Our memories are not evenly distributed. We do not recall every day with equal clarity. We remember the milestones, the turning points, the events that carry symbolic weight. Weddings, funerals, births, these are etched into memory because they are seen as thresholds. That night became such a threshold for me, not because of what it gave, but because of what it took away. It became the marker of when my role shifted from mother at the center to outcast on the margins. The hall itself seemed to conspire in reinforcing this symbolism. The flowers, the lights, the decorations, all carefully chosen to highlight beauty and love, now mocked me with their perfection. The laughter of guests, which should have been a chorus of celebration, sounded distant, like a language I no longer understood. Even the photographs being taken throughout the evening became painful in my mind. I knew that in the albums and frames that would line their future walls, I would be either absent or present only as a shadow in the background, a reminder of a woman who no longer belonged. And so the ritual continued, as rituals always do, indifferent to the pain of individuals. The vows were spoken, the toasts were made, the dances began. Life went on for them, while for me, time had split. Before the ceremony, I had believed I still had a place. After, I knew that place had been erased. The wedding had not only bound two lives together, it had unbound mine from theirs. The very symbol of unity had become the marker of my exclusion, and that truth carried a weight I would never be able to set down. As the music carried on and the guests returned to their conversations, my mind slipped far away from that hall. It went back to the beginning, to the years when he was just a child in my arms, and I was the one who decided if he would eat, if he would be warm, if he would be safe. Humiliation in the present always summons memories of sacrifice from the past, because the pain is not only about what is happening now, but about what it erases. Each word of rejection spoken that night dragged behind it the weight of years where my entire existence had revolved around him. I remembered nights spent sitting by his bed when fever gripped his small body. I held damp cloths to his forehead, whispered songs to calm him, and prayed to a God I was not even sure was listening, because all I wanted was to keep my boy alive. I remembered winters where my hands cracked from scrubbing floors so he could have boots sturdy enough to walk to school without his feet freezing. I remembered summers where I denied myself new clothes so he could go on class trips and feel like he belonged among other children. The memory of sacrifice is heavy, but it is a weight a mother carries willingly. That night, however, those sacrifices felt like they had vanished into a void, as if they had never existed. There is a peculiar cruelty in realizing that years of devotion can be erased in an instant of public rejection. Parents across the world share similar stories. A mother in another town, another country, may tell you how she skipped meals so her child could eat, only to later be ignored when she needed help. A father may tell you about working double shifts so his daughter could attend college, only to find she barely visits once she graduates. My story was not unique, but that did not make it any less devastating. It reminded me that love, no matter how fierce, does not always guarantee loyalty. The images of his childhood paraded through my mind like ghosts. His first steps across the kitchen floor, his small hand gripping mine so tightly when he was afraid of the dark, the way his face lit up when I clapped for him at school recitals. These are the moments that define a parent's life. They are stitched into the fabric of memory with threads of love and pride. And yet that night, I realized those threads could unravel far quicker than I ever imagined. Psychologists often talk about the imbalance of memory in family relationships. Children forget the endless nights of care, the invisible sacrifices, because they are too young to understand them. Parents, on the other hand, never forget, because those moments are etched into their identity. That night, as I stood surrounded by whispers and stares, I felt the crushing weight of that imbalance. I carried every memory of what I had given, while he seemed to carry none of it. I thought of the countless meals I had prepared, the way I always served him first, the way I stretched recipes to make sure he never felt hunger. Food is one of the most powerful languages of love, and for years it was my way of telling him he mattered more than anything. Now, as I stood unwanted in that wedding hall, I realized the plates I had filled had not translated into permanence. Acts of service, no matter how vital, can fade in memory once they become expected. What is constant is often taken for granted. Even the sound of his laughter as a child returned to me. The high, unrestrained joy that used to echo through our small home, making every hardship feel worthwhile. That laughter had been my reward, my confirmation that love was enough. Hearing his silence now, in the face of my rejection, was the cruel opposite of that joy. Where once his voice had been my comfort, now his silence was my undoing. I could not help but wonder how memories shift in the mind of a child as they grow. Perhaps he remembered the times I was strict more than the times I was gentle. Perhaps he remembered the disappointments I could not prevent more than the sacrifices I made in silence. Human memory is selective, and sometimes it clings to the sharp edges instead of the soft ones. That possibility haunted me because it meant the story I carried of our life together might not be the story he carried. Sociologists often speak of generational amnesia, the tendency of one generation to forget the struggles of the one before it. Children raised in comfort often forget the cost of that comfort. That night, standing there in the glow of chandeliers and surrounded by luxury, I realized that he had perhaps fallen victim to that amnesia. The child who once clung to me had become a man who no longer saw the foundation on which his life was built. And yet, even in the midst of humiliation, those memories did not fade for me. They pressed harder, reminding me of the love that had shaped my life, love that had been constant, love that had demanded nothing but recognition in return. To see that love dismissed so easily was a wound that no ceremony could heal. It left me asking the unanswerable question: how can years of devotion disappear in the shadow of one night's rejection? As the ceremony continued without me, my memories remained louder than the music, sharper than the laughter, heavier than the clinking of glasses. They wrapped around me like a cloak, both comforting and suffocating, reminding me that I had given everything and received nothing in return. It was the cruel arithmetic of family sacrifice. Years of giving can be balanced in the eyes of others by a single moment of dismissal. And that was the truth that seared into me as I stood there, remembering and realizing that memory alone was now all I had left. The weight of age had never felt so heavy as it did in that hall. Until then, I had carried my years with a quiet dignity, proud of every wrinkle that marked the struggles I had overcome, every silver strand of hair that testified to survival. But in that moment of rejection, my age became something different. It was no longer a badge of endurance, but a label of irrelevance. I was not just unwelcome, I was old and unwelcome. And in a society that worships youth, that double sentence was devastating. It is strange how quickly age can shift from being respected to being despised. In some cultures, elders are revered, their words treated as treasures, their presence at ceremonies seen as essential. In other places, aging is treated like a slow exile, a quiet stripping away of importance until the person becomes invisible. That night made me feel the latter. My years of sacrifice, my history, my motherhood, all of it was overshadowed by the simple fact that I was older and therefore easier to discard. My presence was not seen as wisdom, but as weight. The sting of being treated as disposable reminded me of stories I had heard from other mothers. Women who had worked their entire lives for their families, only to be left in nursing homes with occasional visits, or in houses that grew quieter each year until silence was the only companion. I used to think those stories belonged to other people, to women who had not built the same closeness I thought I had with my son. But as I stood there in the middle of a wedding hall filled with laughter I was no longer invited to share, I realized that aging makes all mothers vulnerable. We all risk becoming characters in that same tragic story, no matter how much love we once gave. Age also changes how humiliation is experienced. When you are young, rejection might sting, but it still leaves you with the belief that time is on your side, that you can rebuild, that you can prove yourself again. When you are older, rejection feels final. There are no decades left to reclaim what has been lost. There is no second chance to rewrite the narrative. Every insult feels heavier because it settles on years already lived, years that cannot be redone. That night, I felt the cruelty of that truth. My exclusion was not just temporary, it was permanent. It was the rewriting of my role in my son's life, and at my age, there was no way to rewrite it back. The humiliation of being cast aside was sharpened by the awareness that I could not escape the stereotype placed upon women like me. Society often paints older women as burdens, as reminders of decay, as people whose usefulness has passed. It forgets that behind every aging woman is a lifetime of endurance, of stories, of sacrifices. It forgets that these women once carried the weight of entire households on their shoulders. That night, I was no longer seen as the woman who had built my son's foundation. I was seen as the woman who stood in the way of his future. I looked around the hall and saw how easily the young celebrated, how quickly they forgot that one day they too would carry the marks of age. I wanted to shake them, to tell them that time comes for everyone, that one day they would understand what it meant to be pushed aside because of wrinkles, because of tired bones, because of the slowing of steps. But I remained silent because I knew they would not listen. Youth never believes it will age. It lives under the illusion of permanence, blind to the fact that the very people they discard are living mirrors of their own future. It is said that in some ancient tribes, elders were considered the memory of the community. To dishonor them was to dishonor the entire lineage because they carried in their stories the lessons of survival. I thought of that as I stood there, realizing that my son's new family had chosen to erase that memory rather than embrace it. They had chosen to treat the past as disposable, as though the future could exist without roots. Yet even a tree with bright leaves will die if its roots are cut. That truth haunted me as I felt myself being severed from the soil of my own family. The irony was bitter. I had once believed that growing old would finally bring peace, that after years of struggle, I would be allowed to rest in the warmth of my family's gratitude. Instead, growing old had made me an easier target. My tired body, my fragile hands, my slowed steps, all of it was used as unspoken evidence that I belonged on the margins, not in the center. I was not honored for having endured. I was dismissed for no longer being new. And yet, as the night went on, a different kind of strength stirred in me. Age may make the body weaker, but it also gives perspective that the young cannot understand. I realized that while they could erase me from their ceremonies, they could not erase the truth of what I had given. They could not rewrite the nights I stayed awake for him, the years I spent building his foundation. They could not erase the fact that every part of his life was built on sacrifices he had long forgotten. They could not erase the reality that without me, he would not even be standing there in that suit with a ring on his finger, beginning a new chapter. Still, the sting of that night remained sharp. Being seen as disposable, as irrelevant, was not something strength alone could heal. It was a wound carved not just by rejection, but by the weight of years that made the rejection absolute. As the music played and the celebration carried on, I stood there carrying the invisible truth that every person in that hall would one day face the same fate. They too would age. They too would be tested by the cruelty of being forgotten. And when that time came, I wondered if they would remember me, the woman who had been cast aside at a wedding, a living reminder that in the end, no one escapes the judgment of time. The words she spoke that night settled in my mind like stones dropped into still water, each syllable sending ripples that would never cease. "You no longer exist for us," was not just an insult, not just a sentence of exclusion. It was a declaration of erasure, a verdict passed in front of witnesses who could never unhear it. Words have power, and some words have a violence that is physical. Neurologists have found that the brain registers verbal attacks in the same regions it does physical pain. I felt that reality in every fiber of my being. My chest tightened, my throat constricted, and a cold wave ran through my spine. It was as though her voice had struck me, leaving marks that could not be seen but could not be ignored. Public humiliation amplifies pain because it transforms private grief into spectacle. I could see it in the faces of the guests, how they recoiled or leaned forward with curiosity. Humans are wired to respond to social cues, to witness and judge the social standing of others. What made it unbearable was that the judgment was implicit. Some guests were horrified, but horror alone does not restore dignity. Others seemed fascinated, as if witnessing the destruction of someone's identity were a form of entertainment. The hall, once a place of joy, became a theater of cruelty, where every eye became a mirror reflecting my shame back at me. I tried to focus on the details around me, searching for something neutral, something to anchor me. The chandelier crystals glinted in the overhead light. The folds of the tablecloths looked impossibly white. The delicate petals of the centerpieces were almost painful in their perfection. Yet every object, no matter how beautiful, reminded me of my absence from the celebration. Beauty became mocking. Celebration became exclusion. Every smile I passed by seemed taunting. Every raised glass a signal that I was not part of this circle, that my life, my sacrifices, my presence could be disregarded without consequence. I thought about the weight of words throughout history. Dictators and tyrants understood their power. Philosophers noted that language can shape reality. In families, this same principle holds. A phrase spoken in anger, in authority, or in performance can rearrange relationships, creating fractures that echo for years. Her words that night were not accidental. They were a precise strike, intended to reorder the family hierarchy, to assert control, and to declare that I was no longer central. What I had once assumed was natural affection, earned through years of care and sacrifice, had been rendered irrelevant by a single sentence. Even the most mundane moments after those words carried their weight. When I shifted my gaze, I could see the subtle movements of the guests. Heads turned, conversations paused, eyes flicked from her to me and back again. I became hyper-aware of the silence that followed the declaration. Silence is often thought of as neutrality, but in social contexts, it can be a form of consent. Every pause, every unspoken comment, every restrained reaction reinforced her power and compounded my humiliation. I was not just excluded by her words, but by the collective acknowledgement of them, by the absence of intervention. The mind has a way of replaying certain moments in vivid loops. I could hear her voice again, rising and falling, seeing her expression of triumph and certainty. It was almost as though time had slowed, stretching that single sentence across the hours, the minutes, the seconds. Memory amplifies trauma because it does not simply record events. It interprets them, layering them with emotions, intentions, and context that can make pain feel eternal. I felt trapped in that sentence, unable to escape, unable to breathe freely, unable to erase what had been said. Words also create invisible boundaries. A single phrase can redraw the lines of inclusion and exclusion. And that night, those lines were drawn with sharp clarity. I had always imagined my role in his life as permanent, irreplaceable, a cornerstone that would endure no matter the circumstances. Yet her declaration rendered that fantasy null. It was not just an insult. It was an assertion that the architecture of our relationship had been dismantled. I was no longer part of the house we had built together. I was standing outside its walls, watching as others continued the life I had nurtured. Even scientific studies in social psychology show that public shaming changes perception not only for the victim, but for the observers. People unconsciously align with the speaker who asserts authority in a social setting. That evening, every guest became an involuntary participant in my erasure. Their gaze, their posture, their subtle reactions all communicated agreement, or at least acceptance, of the claim that I no longer existed in the narrative of my own family. The collective silence confirmed the sentence, transforming her personal attack into a social verdict. And yet, there was another layer to the wound. Words are not merely heard. They linger, echoing long after they are spoken. They settle into memory and reappear at the oddest moments, a soundtrack of humiliation that can intrude on sleep, on quiet moments, on the mind's attempt at peace. I could already feel the long-term weight, the kind of burden that reshapes identity. Some researchers call this the socialization of trauma, when events witnessed by others are internalized to the point that personal boundaries dissolve and self-perception becomes distorted. I understood that well that night because every fiber of my being registered her judgment as absolute. Even the simplest interactions afterward became colored by the words. A guest's polite smile felt like mockery. A compliment from a distant relative rang hollow. Even my own thoughts betrayed me, replaying the sentence, emphasizing its cruelty, dissecting every nuance as if it were a riddle I could not solve. Human memory is selective, but trauma ensures that certain statements take precedence, and in my mind, her declaration became a landmark I could never pass unnoticed. I tried to remind myself that words, though powerful, cannot erase reality. I had been the mother who nurtured, protected, and loved unconditionally. Those acts were not negated by her speech, but the psychological impact of verbal assault in public is profound because it challenges the victim's perception of self. My identity, carefully built through years of care and devotion, felt fragile, as though it had been exposed to elements it was never meant to endure. That fragility was terrifying because it created doubt, and doubt can be more devastating than malice. As I stood there, absorbing every sound, every stare, every echo of her voice, I realized that the sentence she delivered would linger far beyond the ceremony. It would travel through stories whispered among guests, revisited in photos, retold in conversation. Words have a life of their own, and those words had been set loose to define me, to shape my role, to mark me as someone who no longer mattered. And in the quiet of that awareness, I felt the full scope of what it meant to be erased by language in front of those who once witnessed my love and devotion as proof of belonging. As I looked around the hall, it became painfully clear that I was not just rejected by words, but abandoned by presence. Family members who should have been anchors instead became invisible, their silence louder than any argument could have been. Tios, aunts, cousins, and siblings, people who once shared in laughter, shared in meals, shared in ordinary moments, now watched, hesitant, unwilling to intervene. Social psychologists describe this as bystander effect, where individuals fail to act because responsibility is diffused among the group. But in that hall, it felt less like diffusion and more like a conscious agreement to let me be erased. Their inaction was a verdict, an unspoken confirmation of the judgment passed by her voice and my son's silence. There is a particular cruelty in being watched and ignored by the people who should protect you. Children learn early that family is the safety net, the home in which pain can be held and comforted. But when that net is removed, the fall feels endless. I remembered countless moments when my own family had been my haven, when voices of support rose for me when the world seemed heavy. That night, no one stood, no one spoke, and the absence of protection left a void that expanded with every heartbeat. I could feel the distance between me and them stretch as though it were a tangible wall, separating me from the family that should have been mine. The psychological impact of collective silence is profound. Researchers have studied the phenomenon where groups witnessing injustice can exacerbate trauma simply by failing to respond. In that room, every muted gaze, every cautious glance, every averted eye reinforced my exclusion. It is one thing to be attacked directly. It is another to be attacked while others condone it through their stillness. Their inaction was not neutral. It was a silent chorus that magnified the insult, that confirmed that the person I had trusted most had indeed chosen to side with her. I thought of the dinners we had shared, the celebrations of small victories, the birthdays where everyone laughed together. Those memories now felt distant, almost surreal, because the present had replaced them with a tableau of betrayal. When someone is abandoned in front of witnesses, memory reframes itself. Nostalgia can twist into grief, and shared joy can be reinterpreted as proof of what has been lost. Every smile in my mind became a reminder of what no longer existed. Every toast a symbol of absence rather than connection. Even strangers in the room seemed to sense the tension. Guests not connected to the family shifted uncomfortably, whispered under their breath, glanced sideways, unsure if they should intervene or pretend nothing had happened. Humans are social creatures, and we are wired to recognize and respond to conflict. Yet many choose observation over action when stakes are socially complex, when alliances are unclear. I could see that hesitation in their faces, and it made the isolation I felt even more intense. I was visible yet completely alone, a paradox of social presence. The abandonment by family illuminated a truth I had long suspected but never fully confronted. Loyalty is not guaranteed. Years of shared experience, of sacrifice, of love and care do not always secure a place in someone else's allegiance. Anthropologists have observed similar dynamics in various cultures, where familial bonds can be fragile, especially when new social structures emerge, such as marriage. I was witnessing that fragility in real time, feeling the tension of shifting loyalties as a painful physical weight in my chest. There was a strange sense of choreography in their inaction. Every glance, every subtle movement contributed to a tableau of estrangement. They were actors in a silent play where my role was to be marginalized, to be observed and assessed, but not defended. This is one of the most subtle forms of cruelty, the performance of normalcy while actively participating in exclusion. It is a violence without sound, a judgment without words, yet its impact can rival any shouted insult. I remembered the conversations I had with relatives in previous years, casual and affectionate exchanges that now felt like echoes from another life. The warmth, the shared understanding, the small jokes, gone, replaced with cold neutrality, polite distance, and the silent enforcement of my marginalization. Sociologists suggest that family systems are maintained not just by communication, but also by tacit consent to rules and boundaries. That night, the boundaries had been redrawn, and I had been moved outside them. Every look from my relatives reinforced the new structure. Even the youngest members of the family seemed to understand the tension. Children are astute observers of social hierarchy. Their wide eyes tracked my every move, reflecting confusion and apprehension. Even though they could not comprehend the full gravity of the situation, they sensed it viscerally. That sensitivity intensified my humiliation because in their observation, my exclusion became visible across generations. The social dynamic was being transmitted silently, creating a living lesson in family power and loyalty. I could feel how isolation accumulates. Every small gesture of indifference, every carefully avoided glance, every whispered conversation in which I was conspicuously absent became a brick in the wall separating me from them. The hall, once a place of celebration, now felt like a cage. Human beings instinctively seek connection, and the denial of connection in a group setting has measurable physiological effects, including elevated heart rate, cortisol levels, and feelings of helplessness. My body responded as if under siege, and yet, in that moment, clarity emerged from pain. I understood the subtle architecture of the rejection. It was not only her attack, not only my son's silence, but the collective agreement of inaction that cemented my marginalization. The family had silently aligned with her, consciously or unconsciously, and the structure of our relationships had shifted irrevocably. Their stillness spoke volumes. It confirmed the verdict, carved into memory as indelibly as any shouted insult. I was abandoned, and the abandonment was witnessed, observed, and tacitly approved by everyone present. When the music faded into the background and the final glasses were clinked in polite celebration, I found myself walking alone through corridors that had once felt familiar but now seemed alien. The echo of laughter, the soft murmur of conversations, the footsteps of those moving on with the evening. It all sounded distant, almost like it belonged to another world. Returning home after such a night was like stepping into a different dimension, one where the pain of exclusion followed me with relentless precision. The world outside the wedding hall had not changed, yet everything inside me had shifted irreversibly. The first moments of solitude were disorienting. My hands, which had held plates, adjusted napkins, and steadied my son when he was a child, now trembled as if they carried the invisible weight of all the rejection in the hall. I passed through the door of my home, and the familiar scent of comfort, coffee, old wood, the faint aroma of linens, seemed muted, unable to compete with the echo of humiliation that lingered in my mind. Psychologists describe this as emotional aftershock, a period when the body continues to respond to trauma even after the triggering event has ended. I felt it fully, every nerve alive to the memory, every muscle wound tight from the ordeal. Sitting down in my quiet house, the contrast between the warmth of home and the coldness of what had just occurred was sharp. A home is meant to be a sanctuary, yet that night, no familiar walls could shield me from the memory of the hall. The details returned in vivid clarity. The way my son had stood mute, the harshness of her words, the piercing gaze of relatives who refused to intervene. Even mundane objects, the couch where I had once held him as a child, the table where I had served countless meals, now seemed to bear witness to my erasure. Memory and space intertwined, making the entire environment a living archive of my humiliation. Sleep did not come easily. Scientists have found that traumatic events activate the amygdala, the part of the brain that governs fear and emotional memory. This often leads to hypervigilance, racing thoughts, and fragmented sleep. As I lay in my bed, I felt every word she had spoken replay in my mind. The phrase, "You no longer exist for us," became a persistent echo, insistent, reshaping the contours of my inner reality. I could hear it in my ears, as if the walls of the house themselves had absorbed it and refused to let it go. I thought about the rituals of recovery in other cultures. Many traditions emphasize reflection and community to help process social pain. In some societies, elders gather after conflict to recount stories, to reassert their place, to repair fractures in relationships. But that night, I had no communal balm. No one reached out to hold my hand, to acknowledge the pain, to help me reconstruct the invisible fabric of my identity. In a sense, I was alone in my mourning, navigating the aftermath without a map, without the guidance of collective support, the quiet, amplified reflection. I remembered the countless times I had imagined supporting him in moments of celebration. I had imagined my voice offering encouragement, my hands adjusting ties, my eyes shining with pride. Instead, I had been rendered invisible, a ghost in a scene I had helped shape from the very beginning. Anthropologists note that social exclusion, especially in ritualistic or ceremonial contexts, leaves deep cognitive and emotional traces because it attacks not only identity, but memory itself. The night's events would not fade. They had been encoded into my life story with brutal permanence. Even the act of walking through familiar spaces became a meditation on loss. Each room held memories of nurturing, guidance, and shared laughter. The kitchen where I had once prepared countless meals became a theater for recollection of the meals I had stretched to feed him. The living room where we celebrated birthdays now reflected an absence, a silence that was denser than any conversation. Space and memory merged, creating a layered reality where the house itself seemed to mourn alongside me, echoing back the emotional trauma that had entered with the words and the stares. I noticed how my mind worked to catalog the layers of pain. There was the immediate humiliation, public and undeniable. Then there was the quiet betrayal, the recognition that those who should have defended me had not. Then there was the enduring sorrow, the slow, creeping grief that accompanies understanding that certain relationships may never be restored. Cognitive psychologists note that trauma often presents in layers, with each new reflection adding depth to the initial shock. I experienced each layer fully, unable to isolate one from the other, each feeding into the next in a relentless chain. The evening also prompted reflection on resilience. Humans have an innate capacity to survive emotional trauma, but survival does not erase the wound. It alters it, embeds it into the psyche, and shapes how future interactions are perceived. I felt that as I moved through the quiet of my home, aware of every creak of the floorboards, every distant hum of traffic outside, each sound, mundane and ordinary, became a backdrop for the complex interplay of grief, anger, and self-preservation. My mind attempted to anchor itself, to hold on to reason, but emotion flooded every corner. Even small sensory experiences were colored by the events. The softness of the chair where I sat, the warmth of the tea I poured for myself, the dim glow of the lamp, everything contrasted with the piercing clarity of rejection, making comfort feel temporary, fleeting, almost unreal. Researchers studying post-traumatic experience note that ordinary sensations often become heightened or distorted after acute emotional events, and I could feel that truth in every fiber of my body. Reality itself had taken on a new, sharper edge, one that did not easily accommodate peace. In that quiet, I also reflected on memory and narrative. Stories we tell ourselves shape our perception of events and ourselves. That night had rewritten the narrative I had built for decades, turning years of dedication and love into a moment of exclusion. It forced a confrontation with identity. Who am I when the family I helped raise rejects me publicly? What remains of self-worth when the acknowledgement of a lifetime's labor is denied? These questions pulsed through my mind with a rhythm as relentless as a heartbeat. And so I sat, alone in the house that should have been sanctuary, surrounded by objects that bore silent witness to the life I had built, grappling with the profound emptiness that followed a public betrayal. The echoes of the wedding hall lingered, not only as memory, but as presence, as if the night itself had followed me home. Time moved forward in the world outside, yet within me, the events of that evening stretched and folded endlessly, leaving me to navigate a labyrinth of emotion, memory, and reflection that no comfort could easily untangle. In the quiet of the night, after the laughter had faded and the wedding hall had emptied, I sat alone with the weight of reflection pressing on me. The rejection, the humiliation, and the silence of my son and relatives had carved a space inside me that felt endless, a hollow place where love and trust had once lived. And yet, in that stillness, a strange clarity began to emerge. Life had shown me in the harshest way that our worth is not always determined by how others treat us, but by the love we carry within ourselves, the sacrifices we have made, and the resilience we nurture in the face of betrayal. I thought about all the moments that had built my life as a mother, each small act of devotion, each night of vigil, each word of encouragement whispered when the world seemed too cruel for him to face alone. Those memories, though intertwined with pain now, were mine to hold. They could not be erased by the words of another, no matter how public, no matter how cutting. The years of care, the countless small gestures, and the unwavering commitment remained as an indelible mark of love, a testament to the life I had poured into raising someone who, despite his choices, would always be connected to me through the invisible threads of shared history. Pain has a way of deepening understanding. It forces us to confront truths we might otherwise avoid. That night taught me that love is not transactional, that the bonds we create are not guaranteed protection against cruelty, and that our identity is most tested in the moments when the world turns its back on us. Yet, even in rejection, there is the possibility of growth, of reclaiming power by choosing how we respond. I realized that while I could not control their choices or erase their words, I could choose to honor the love that had defined my life. I could carry forward with dignity and let that love guide the next chapter of my journey. There is a profound beauty in acceptance. Accepting that some relationships may never meet our expectations, that some bonds can be fractured beyond repair, is not defeat. It is a recognition of reality and a conscious choice to invest energy in what we can nurture. It is understanding that we cannot demand loyalty or gratitude, but we can continue to be the people we aspire to be. The night of my exclusion became a mirror reflecting not only the cruelty of others, but also the depth of my own resilience. I discovered that even when placed at the margins, a mother's love does not vanish. It transforms, strengthens, and endures. In the hours that followed, I began to feel a quiet sense of liberation. The hall had tried to define me, the words had tried to erase me, but I found that my essence could not be confined to a single moment. Memory and history belong to the one who has lived them. I had nurtured, I had sacrificed, I had loved fiercely. That is a power no one can take. In solitude, I allowed myself to honor that strength, to acknowledge that while pain had left its mark, it had also clarified the boundaries of my worth. I was more than the rejection I had endured. I was the accumulation of decades of unwavering commitment. Life moves forward, even after the deepest of wounds. There will be other moments, other people, other experiences where the echoes of that night may return. But each step forward is a reaffirmation that we are not defined by the cruelty of others, but by the choices we make in response to it. In that stillness, I found the courage to imagine new beginnings, spaces where respect and recognition are present, spaces where love is reciprocated. And I understood that the journey does not end with rejection. It continues with self-discovery, with dignity, and with the quiet reclaiming of our own narrative. If you have ever felt overlooked, rejected, or silenced, know that you are not alone. The pain is real, but so is the power you hold within. History is filled with examples of resilience rising from heartbreak, of people who turned betrayal into a renewed sense of purpose. We cannot rewrite the past, but we can shape the present, and by doing so, we influence the future. The strength that emerges from such experiences is subtle but unbreakable, a testament to the human capacity for endurance and love, even in the face of adversity. As the night deepened and the world outside slept, I gave thanks, not only for the love I had shared and the lessons I had learned, but for the opportunity to continue, to rise, and to honor my own journey. I understood that each experience, no matter how painful, carries a seed of transformation, and in that understanding, I felt a quiet hope, a recognition that life, even after betrayal, still holds moments of beauty, reflection, and growth. Thank you for sharing this story with me. If this narrative resonated with you, the next video on your screen dives even deeper into real-life stories of resilience, overcoming hardship, and the unexpected strength we discover when the world turns its back. Click now to continue the journey, and let these stories remind you that even in the darkest moments, there is always a path forward.